So, good afternoon, everyone. I am both happy and somewhat tinged with sadness that our conference is about to come to an end.
But there is a continuation tomorrow.
There's a continuation tomorrow. There's always a continuation because many things in Israel, the end really isn't the end. So I'll just do a little promo for tomorrow morning at what time, Leova? At 10?
10.
At 10? Perhaps maybe in this room.
Yes.
One of our distinguished guests, Professor Sam Moyn, will lead a seminar on
cosmopolitanism and
human rights, I assume.
and the Universal Declaration.
Oh, wow. Good stuff. And we continue also Sunday afternoon. Ben Nathans, to my right, University of Pennsylvania, will speak at 4 o'clock in the Carter Building on Amnesty International and the Soviet dissident movement, correct? Yep. So the fun never ends. We have a delightful panel here, which alphabetically begins with Professor Trubowicz of Tel Aviv. Alphabetically. No, you want to be an EMSA?
The end.
You want to be at the end. So, who wants to start? We will begin with Sam Moyn, who gave a wonderful keynote lecture, a fascinating keynote presentation last night. Those who didn't see it will soon be online. Sam will speak for 5 or 10 minutes or so, some thoughts about human rights, Jewish rights, minority rights. Then we will go to Ben Nathans, University of Pennsylvania, and we'll finish up with Trubowicz of the University of Tel Aviv's Law Center and the Minerva Center for Human Rights. Everybody will have 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then we will happily open up the floor to discussion about many of the great and fascinating and complete unanswerable questions of the past 2 days. Sam.
Great. Well, I'm sure I'm the most confused person in the room, so it's best for me to speak very briefly and get clarity from the rest of you. Maybe I should start by saying, as far as I'm aware, the first time anyone ever held a Jews and Human Rights Conference was in 1974 at McGill University. And there have been a few since that I've run across. I've even been at others. And this one was amazing, very stimulating, I think colored by the place and time in which it's happening, like all conferences, and it seems as if we could reflect on that. I did have more clarity about it, or I maybe had a more pat version of our topic up until about 11:30 this morning. I thought we were thinking about, the history of the intersection of Jewish history and human rights history, or even the invention by Jews of human rights in the 20th century as part of the so-called historical genealogy of human rights discourse. That story had taken us up to the 50s at the latest in all of the papers except Ben's. And then we did jump very, very far into our own time, with the very notable exception, obviously, of Hassan's paper, which gave us an incredibly important dimension to the story we talked about solely from a Jewish perspective before then, but only in the 1940s. And so one thing that's apparent to me is, need for more detail about the intervening period. But maybe I'll start, back at that 1974 conference by reflecting on a big difference between then and now. Most of that conference was about the origins in the Jewish religion of human rights values. And most of the speakers not only took that topic up, but reached a pretty positive conclusion about it. It must be significant that this topic only arose in a radically different context on the last panel at this conference. In Israel, it seems as if we think of human rights as secular values and religious Judaism not as the historical source, but as the living enemy of human rights. Possibly some overlaps, but if not, then at least a topic of very current negotiation. And that seems incredibly significant. Along the way, I wondered what exactly we were talking about. Whose rights or what kind of rights? And I think it's important to think about this because we had, I think, different levels of generality in different talks, and so different objects of study. Maybe at the greatest level of generality, I could be wrong, was Nissim, who thinks about rights almost as equivalent to or very close to universalism in general, the Enlightenment, modernity. Some of those words surfaced, and it is a perfectly viable way of going about it. Others gave the concept of rights maybe more particularity, and that matters because many of us are interested in the internationalization of rights. And so there was a very strange dynamic that went on in this conference, at least from my perspective, because we actually started out with the precise notion of the internationalization of rights given to us by Carroll, not having covered at all the intersection between Jewish history and citizenship understood as citizens' rights starting in 1789, or whenever you think that happened, but starting in the interwar period with the attempted internationalization of rights. But by the end of the conference, we were either talking about modernity in general or the establishment of basic citizenship for a variety of groups in Israel, and not anymore international rights. The Universal Declaration dropped out of the conference. International human rights dropped out of the conference, and I want to come back to that in 1 second. The third point I want to make is about, let's say, internalism. And this really goes to the first 3 quarters of the conference, when it seemed as if we were talking about what Jewish history has to do with human rights history. And the simple point I want to make about the risk of internalism is that when we study a small, relatively unimportant group of people like the Jews, we risk magnifying their contributions or not setting them in the proper context. And so I think if we get interested in the topic of what Jews did for the creation of human rights in the modern world, I think we would often have to expand our focus a bit and ask, who were the other contributors? How important were Jews in the overall story of human rights? Just so for some examples of this, we talked, I think, mainly, there are many papers about the 1940s. That's the era on which we seem to have dealt. We don't know how many Jews, say, relative to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, even knew about the Universal Declaration. We don't know how many Israelis in the 1940s, in 1948 and after, or Palestinians for that matter, knew about the attempted internationalization of rights starting in the 1940s. Very basic questions. And we don't know who else was involved beyond Jews in the 1940s. And so it seems as if we would want to look beyond to try to gauge the importance of the topic we've been talking about against that larger background. Now, I do want to put in a plea in my second to last point for some more Israeli human rights history. Many of us, especially I think Americans here, have been involved in the attempt to historicize international human rights, and we have distinguished it often, although maybe excessively in my case, from civil rights, about which we had a separate movement in the United States. Willie talked about the intersection between the two. We heard a lot about constitutionalization last night. I would really like to have more information about what happened in between the 40s and 50s, when it seems as if international human rights were not terribly relevant to Israel and also to the Palestinian problem, both internally and in the situation of displacement and later occupation. And yet we now know that human rights in their international sense have much to do with this region, and yet we haven't heard anything about that story. It would be very interesting to reconstruct its trajectory, its stages through our time. So the last thing I'll say is that we might want to avoid, even though we've rightly focused on local matters in the last day, we might want to avoid ignoring the rest of the Jews. And here's what I mean by that. Ben gave us a very helpful dichotomy between two groups of Soviet Jews, some of whom were rights defenders and identified with human rights, not merely as a mode of Jewish self-defense or as Jewish nationalism by another name, and then those who were refuseniks and who identified with the right to leave, but were pursuing Jewish politics by other means in a way that Jim Leffler reconstructed earlier. We did talk about what happened to that latter group once they came to Israel, and Ben had some very enlightening things to say there. But it seems as if we may have missed all the non-Jewish Jews, if I can call them that, remembering Isaac Deutscher's label, who have defended human rights, let's say for their own sake, many in the North Atlantic who have no more connection with or identification with Israel and whose sole mode of living out their Jewishness is through defending human rights, not for Jews, but for others, including Palestinians. And that surely applies to lots of Israelis. But it seems as if we may have lost that dimension of the latter part of 20th century and 21st century Jewish history. And that would be very interesting to add in if we had many more days. So I'll stop. Let Franz enlighten us all.
Okay.